Last module is Module 5, Application of Genetic Testing in Clinics. And this was something that I really wanted to get a strong message across to you, that your customer's knowledge base in genetics is going to be extreme to barely nothing, and that you are going to be therefore talking head to head with somebody who's very knowledgeable in this field, to somebody who you're going to have to teach them the ways of and the value of molecular testing in cancers. So some of the information that I picked up and I found to be sort of quite interesting is that there's clearly a discordance between understanding the value of genetics and the action. You can see here that many of the respondents in this test, in this survey that was published recently, shows you that the clinicians do believe that genetics do affect patients' drug response. However, when you look at what information and knowledge they garnered at medical school, it drops quite dramatically to 29%. They don't feel, there's only a small number that feel adequately informed about genetic testing, in this case connecting the pharmacology part, the drugs, to the genetics. And then, as you can see, that a small percentage of, while there's a huge belief in its value, only a small percentage have actually ordered a test that over the past 6 months. And again, a slight increase, but still a small number feel that they're going to be ordering one of these type of these genetic tests over the next 6 months. So this is what you're up against, folks. You've got this strong knowledge base, but in very key focused areas, and then the majority are really not so well versed in understanding the value. So in a good way, you have an opportunity to get out there as ambassadors for GeneSight and really show the value of genetic testing. And this is very interesting. 74% of interns acknowledge that they have poor or very poor knowledge of genetics, that they have that they don't have a strong understanding of it. And if you're a physician out of medical school for 5 years, then you're out of date, completely out of date. So, and this is one of the things about clinicians, is that they're spoon-fed a lot of information. They have to. I mean, it's a very complex organism, but trying to keep up with it is very difficult. And where they do get the knowledge base from is from pharmaceutical reps that come around and provide them information about the therapeutics, their new drugs, and a little bit more about the biology. 1 out of 10 physicians possess adequate knowledge of genetics. So that's really those people that are in the sort of clinical research cities that are out there, you know, the Boston neighborhoods and like that, Washington, Vanderbilt, and so forth. There's a good one. So physicians actively engaged in combining genetics with cancer understand the value. And as I mentioned, that's typically in the large hospitals and large cities. So that's when you get to the second tier hospitals, that's where you're going to see quite dramatically, especially if you're going to bounce between large cities and sort of a second tier city, you're going to see an incredibly stark difference between the knowledge base and the value adds that these folks see the genetics providing. So you're going to, as I said, you're going to be sort of really preaching to the choir in one place, and you're going to have to really educate as well. So understanding this stuff is really paramount for you, and sounding knowledgeable and really showing them the value of genetics is for their patients is really what you folks can really drive home and make a big difference. I thought this was an interesting little slide here when it came to your political affiliation. I know we shouldn't be talking politics, but it's kind of interesting because clearly some of these areas around the country are very conservative. And if you are somewhat liberal-minded, as you can see, that there is very much an openness and understanding towards genetics versus somebody who's either moderate or conservative that's been occurring over the past 10 to 20, 30 years. So an educated public can drive your tests. And I don't know how to get to the public that way, but clearly trying to think about means of educating the public is very important. So in more liberal areas, that's clearly something where people are willing to accept it. Over some other areas where they clearly say, hey, listen, a doctor's a doctor, and I do whatever he or she says I'm supposed to do when it comes to therapeutic treatment. So there's no discussion, but clearly those areas could be something that you could tap into. And then you know, when you look at the world's education, this is something as well that to keep in mind, is that genetics in the US is really not keeping, the education of genetics is not really keeping pace with the technology. There has been this rapid explosion of technology for sure, and the US sits here in this black line compared to some of the other countries that are out there. So this I thought was interesting because this talks a little bit about how that's changing. So the SACGH, which stands for Secretary's Advisory Committee on Genetics, Health and Society, put a report together in 2011 on the genetics education and training, and they made 6 recommendations. So recommendation 1 is that there clearly needs to be an education of healthcare individuals. It's limited, and that the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, should convene a task force of stakeholders to identify those best mechanisms. Number 2 was that it needs to evaluate the composition of the public health workforce and that knowledge base and responsibilities relating to genetics and genomics. We talked about those 2 differences. And fund the development and implementation of accessible education programs so that people can get that knowledge base. They keep reading about it, they keep hearing about it, but there's some way that they can get educated, maybe a career that they want to move into, so that they can, so there's a continuing education in genetics and genomics for the public health workforce. And that's kind of important for the clinicians in a way, because if they've stepped away from their medical school training, how can they get back in and learn a little bit more about this? You know, should it really be in your hands? Should it be up to you folks to do that education? Well, in a way it helps, but is it going to be something that could be a problem if it's not regulated as to the true understanding of the value? It's a bit like the reps that come around with selling their drugs, and they've got a holiday package for the clinician to say, hey, and that's stopped as well. So this is something that then means that they understand the value of genetics and your understanding of it and how you can sell a good product. Number 3 was to identify and support programs to increase the diversity and genetic competencies of the healthcare workforce, serving underserved communities, and those 2nd tier, maybe even 3rd tier type hospitals or small little practices that are in rural communities. Many of those guys don't even understand anything about genetics, and so even more so, how do you get to those kind of underserved communities where it's very important that they understand when someone walks in that they have a cancer, that it's not all over. There's an opportunity. There's an opportunity to use genetics to define what it is, the molecular profile of that cancer, and to get an appropriate therapeutic drug. So education is very important. The HSS, for number 4, needs to identify effective communication strategies as well for translating genetics knowledge into information that consumers, and we talked about consumers here, and patients can use to make health decisions. I'm a big fan of, as a consumer, to understand what it is I'm consuming, and so I think that the education of the public is very important. And number 5 alludes a little bit to that. Consumers have consistently expressed the desire for accessible and web-based genetic information. It's disparate, it's all over the place. No one really understands who, what, and how this stuff can be of value. So having something that's centralized, that is regulated with regards to knowledge base and is meaningful is very important. And so the recommendation is that the HHS should create and maintain a state-of-the-art internet portal to facilitate access to comprehensive, accessible and trustworthy web-based genetic information and resources for consumers. You guys can be part of that too when it comes to feeding information to clinicians as to good places to go to learn a little bit more about some of that. It could be your website. In fact, your website, David, could be an education portal too for many people to come in, and that could be something to think about to drive the customers to understand very simply the value of genetics. And then once you've got them in there, there's that adoption, there's that sort of, I like this, maybe I should try their product. And then number 6, the HHS should support efforts to educate healthcare professionals, public health providers and consumers about the importance of family health history. We talked a little bit about that. Sometimes there's not always a dot-to-dot connection about family history, and so is it genetic, is it a cancer, so is it something that is the environment? You know, sometimes the clinicians don't quite get that. So that's family history is very important, because if it's a genetic-based predisposition to, then you can do something from very early stages. So just a very kind of overview of companion diagnostics. You've got the genetic profiles and therapeutic treatment. You've got diagnostic test, which is basically a standalone and just says you have a mutation that predisposes you to, or you have BRCA1, and therefore 95% likelihood that. And that's it. There's no therapeutics to come with it because you're not presenting. Then you have, when you're presenting with a disease, how the diagnostic can be of value coupled with a therapeutic, and that diagnostic is called a companion diagnostic. Many companies are starting to see, pharma companies are changing their business model with regards to drug therapies. It's not about a blockbuster anymore, it's about little mini blockbusters, if you like, that gets drugs out, and they have huge pipelines, but it gets them out. There's a companion diagnostic, it addresses a small proportion of the population who have a particular genotype that this therapeutic drug has been shown to be effective for. And that's basically what's going on here, where you're looking at treatment selection based on the based on your genetic profiling, the optimizing the treatment based on dosing. We talked about the CYP genes can help there a little bit, but also when you look at warfarin as a classic, it's a bit of a disaster actually, but it's an example of how you can put people on warfarin, which is a rat poison, which is used to cause massive hemorrhaging, but it also is a blood thinner. And so if you have people like atrial fibrillation, you don't want blood clots getting caught up in your atrium, so a little bit of warfarin can keep the blood thin. Unless you can eat volumes of garlic, this actually works quite nicely. But clinicians refuse to take the opportunity to look at the individual's genetic profile, and so will either dose you and then you'll either hemorrhage all over the place, or you still and then bring it back, which takes a few days to bring you back down to either it's not working and then it just ramps up. And so knowing that how much to get and that dosing is very important, and genetics can provide that, as well as monitoring the prognosis, the progression can help you as well. We talked about sort of a remission, a relapse profile, where perhaps if you can identify that, there's an opportunity to put you on a second therapeutic treatment after the first one has worked efficaciously to remove the major tumor. Okay, so we talked about this. This summarizes what I think that where the NGS technology is. It clearly has outpaced clinical utility, but you folks are starting to bring it in. You're starting to get out there and show that it may have stripped and outpaced and gone way ahead of what the clinical utility is, but look, in a focused manner, and that means targeted, you're actually now applying it in a really good way. We're not talking about sequencing the genome. We're not talking about finding all these mutations in there that tell you something about you that could be of value or may not be of value. We're talking about a disease with a set of genes that are known to be associated with that disease that can help the physician design, develop, or go to the literature and try to find the best therapeutic treatment for the patient. Okay? Over the years, this technology has really improved. You've got reduced costs because you can multiplex. You've got improved cancer profiling, and of course patient stratification, that cancer diagnostic, the companion diagnostic. And then here are really all the players from every part of that pipeline that I took you through yesterday. And the two noisy ones are down here, the Ion Torrent and the Illumina, which, as I mentioned, they have their instruments in pre-IDE for 510K clearance. I don't know how long it's going to take. It's going to be, these guys are going to work very closely with the FDA to walk them through it. But once that instrument's got 510K clearance, then you're going to start to see FDA-approved assays that are on there. That could be something like these panels here. But again, as we talked about, FDA-cleared assays command a higher price. And so there's, because of the high level of regulation that comes with it. And these are sold within Europe as CE marked and FDA cleared over here. And then as the companies take their assays around the world, they'll go through other countries' regulatory clearances to ensure that they can sell them in those markets. And then the medical value for next-gen sequencing is really what I was sort of targeting here a little bit around the companion diagnostic. You have a therapy, you have the companion diagnostic, and you now have a targeted therapy. And that's really what you guys are really driving home here for the clinician, is to try to help them identify a targeted therapy. And of course, the value add to all of this is, from a clinical value, you get the appropriate responder on the right drug. You get patient stratification, and of course you get the therapy dose and duration, which is very important. And then from an economic value, of course, it's about resources, the cost. The fact that you are helping the healthcare system a little bit here in driving costs down by not just saying, oh, you've got lung cancer here, here's a traditional set of drugs, on you go and see what happens. But you're actually trying to help those individuals and provide them and get them back into the workforce, become, you know, beneficial to society so that they can be whole again with some of these terrible diseases that they could be walking around with or are walking around with. And then, of course, the medical value is improved clinical outcomes, which you just mentioned. The healthcare decision really is pretty obvious, and those cost savings. And then this really comes back to the pictures that I showed you yesterday, but this is around non-small cell lung cancer and talks about and really addresses where these drugs are. You can see here there's a load of drugs that sit on these receptors here, the EGFR receptors. You can see as you go down the pathways, the KRAS pathways, that there are drugs directed towards some of these places. You've got sorafenib as well for the RAF, because RAS is such a key player on this that if you block this then and remove any tumors that have this mutation, then you can shut the whole thing down. But as I'm going to show you in the next slide, while there are many genes with potential for targeted therapies, people are starting to sort of take on what's called an adaptive trial design. And this is something that you folks with your genetic profiling can be of value. These two gentlemen here have set up what's called a Battle 2.0, and it's really a biomarker-driven trial for patients with metastatic lung cancer. And what they set up was a four-armed drug program where initially it started off as being a very random affair. Individuals would come in, they would have a biomarker profile done. While it's limited, today those biomarkers get more and more. But they took a biopsy and they then checked their molecular profile, and then just to start off with, they randomly put them onto the forearms of these drug programs and then looked to see what the effect was. And then as they collected more and more samples, they started to see patterns. They would put those individuals that came into the program onto an appropriate arm based on the pattern, the molecular pattern that they saw individuals having where there was a response. Those other individuals that came in early in the program were then taken back out and put into ones where there's a similar pattern. And this type of adaptive trial design is what's going on. This is what clinicians are doing. Now you can see that these guys are in big hospital areas. This is something that's coming out. It's not FDA approved. It's not something that is the be all and end all. They're trying to identify, these guys are trying to identify better ways of bringing these drugs together in combinations that work to completely shut down the tumor, so that while you may have quote unquote a relapse profile, if a combination of these drugs can work, you might be able to even remove some of those cells that have suggestive of a relapse. But importantly though is that combining some of these drugs can also be very detrimental to you, in the sense that it could be tough on you. So I was reading that some people feel that you put them on that, then you kind of take them off it and you put them on that type of regime as well, especially if there is some individuals that are responding to these combination targeted therapies. This is really what your product is providing to the customer, and is basically a set of nice, as I looked at it, focused and informative molecular profiling. You have a small amount of tissue required. You're talking about 10 nanograms here, which I think is great. Broad range of cancer panels to choose from. The panels that are up there are comprised of genes in focused disease pathways. The accuracy of the results are determined by the technology and the software. Speedy turnaround time, we've seen the value of that one, and that's a real big standout. Standardized reports, and we'll be going through that a little bit after this, which are easy to interpret for the physician, so you can show them an example. And then cost-effective prices compared to some of the other places that we've looked at, where we've got some intel. And then finally, of course, there's reimbursement, which is really on your shoulders a little bit, but you can see that these are tests that are going to be reimbursed. And then finally, I just think that as you get out there and start talking to your customers, keep reading, keep going, keep understanding the topic. And if you have any questions, I am available. There's my email address. Either send me an email directly or send it through to David, especially if it's like all sorts of similar questions. But I'm happy to help you folks out in any way that I can as you start to get out there and start talking to your customers. And you sit there and go, oh, you didn't say anything about that. So if there's anything I can do. And that's really concludes the 5 modules. So thank you very much.